did appreciate the opportunity to come over and spend just a few minutes with you, thanking you mostly for being here and for doing this really hard work. There is a lot of hard work that we do, but this seems particularly difficult. And it's been, I started in this position a little over 7 years ago in January of 2011. And I'd worked in healthcare. I was general counsel at a children's hospital, and we had all the latest. We had a brand new hospital in California, the newest one then, which is now 25 years old, but a lot of technology. And I'm a lawyer and a social scientist, so I don't do numbers, I don't do tech. Turn it on, if it works, it works. It's the extent of what I know about tech. But I've had to do a lot, and in this particular space of interoperability, and I think that cybersecurity and interoperability go so closely together. I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago with a Commonwealth Fund sponsored an activity about the link between interoperability and cybersecurity, and boy, the cybersecurity stuff really scared me if I wasn't scared enough. But what we do with the data and how it gets transferred is so difficult. And when I first came into this position in January of 2011, California was then on an experiment with Cal eConnect. Oh, hi, Neil. And there were, they had set up this nonprofit, and it was going to connect everybody. And within the first few weeks, I had to go to a meeting of the board of Cal eConnect. And there was this raging dispute that we had a 20-member board, and everybody was represented, it seemed like, on the board. And they were fighting over opt-in or opt-out. I had no idea what they were talking about, opt-in or opt-out. And the long and the short of it, within 2 years, the nonprofit had folded. It didn't have any funding, and it had to be dissolved. And the first thing I was engaged with in this job was presiding over the demise of Cal eConnect. So I had to immediately sort of get into the conversation and understand. We had 3 different county systems in California. We were trying to build a single streamlined application between Medi-Cal and covered California, and none of it fit or talked to each other. And it seems now, 7+ years into it, we are really at the cusp of being in a position to really have interoperability. And I, like so many people, have been so frustrated by how could we have so much diversity and have so many problems or challenges associated with it. When I went to this Commonwealth Fund conversation a few weeks ago, the guy that first spoke about interoperability, and I'm going to show you some, I told you I don't do numbers, so I can't remember the numbers, but this really hit for me and caused me to take a breath and say, okay, we really are just now ready to begin real work on interoperability. And the example that he used was a New York Times article from December of 1901. And it was about the telephone industry. And he said in 1901, there were 2 million phone users in the United States. 1.3 of them were using AT&T. The other 700,000 were on 2,811 independent networks. It's hard to believe that we had almost 3,000 independent telephone networks that weren't interoperable. They didn't connect, they didn't talk to each other. But his point was they had to have that much capacity in the system before they could get to interoperability. And they did within a relatively, now there was some pretty heavy government regulation and breaking up the trust around that time. And I won't even start down that path. But it did make it clear to me that it's sort of if you build it, they will come. We now have a lot of data and a lot of demand for access to that data, and a lot more appreciation for what can go wrong in what this opt-in, opt-out. So as I read the news lately about the Cambridge Analytica and the use of the data that was captured from Facebook, one of the issues there that was interesting to me to read was this question of maybe it wasn't actually illegal what they did with that data, because everybody has a user agreement that you click agree. How many times do we get down to something that we want access to, and it says agree, and we say, okay, agree, and you get access to it? All those little agree clicks are giving someone permission to do something with our data, and we don't know what that is. More and more, we are aware. We also have, when it's interesting to me that HIPAA is thought of as privacy, and it certainly has been used for that, but it was really about portability and accountability. That's what the name HIPAA was. And we, don't have the portability, which was pitched so that we only have one kind of claims form that everybody has to do. But the accountability has been more a sword than a shield. It's been more used to keep us apart from each other in data than to allow us to actually use the data constructively. But using the data constructively has its own set of silos associated with what it is we want to do with it. Then we've got the proprietary, which was a P that wasn't even in HIPAA. And everybody, you've got Cerna and Epic and all the other different companies that have built a system that they want to maintain proprietary exclusivity for. So I'm just saying, I have a teeny little nose under the hood of what you are all dealing with, and I want you to know it's really hard. I know it's hard, and I am so grateful that people like you are coming together, that the stewards of change are bringing you together, that the funders are providing the resource to try to get you together, and God love you. I hope you succeed. We are doing as much as we can in California to try to create the environment for that success. I just am so grateful for the leadership that Mike Wilkening has provided at the agency, where we have started with open data. That was my first real passion, was getting the data, and I thought we were going to unlock the data for the public. Woohoo, we unlocked it for ourselves. Every time I turned around, we were finding some way that we could use the information if we could only get to it. And so we are very committed to continuing that momentum around open data for our own use in government, but also for the availability and accessibility of information throughout the system for the providers, but for the patients, ultimately putting the patients as the primary user. Most of these systems, as you well know, were developed for other users, and every user that develops a system develops it for whatever it is they have a need for. And that's why we have this mishigosh of mess. I always say Rube Goldberg wouldn't build a machine that looked like this. It's almost completely irrational. And so Again, I am really here to take just a few minutes to welcome you here. Some of you are not from California. Those of you that are lucky to be in California. I feel lucky to be in California. We have resources and commitment and talent, and I know if anybody can do this work, we will do it here. And so, Daniel, I don't know if you wanted more from me, or if there are questions that you think I might be able to defer to someone else to answer, I would be happy to take them. Sure, I'm happy to take a few questions, or even just comments. I know so many of you from working together on projects, but I'm very delighted to have you here. Yes, ma'am, and then I'll come back over here.
Getting money from the federal government to help pay for the infrastructure of all these data systems so that interoperability can occur is available at that 90-10 rate for 3 years and just a few more months from CMS from the high-tech funding for specialized funding. And it's extended beyond just Medicaid providers now to all those kinds of services that help Medicaid providers do better, more coordinated care. So I'm just making a pitch, essentially, to California as a state to come together and really think big about that ask. 10% upfront can bring hundreds of millions of dollars actually. And just as a data reference, North Dakota recently had an approved plan for their first set of expansion of technology infrastructure from CMS. There's less than 700,000 people in the state of North Dakota, and they received $22 million in federal funding to go through the fiscal year 2019 with the promise that they can come back for up to $47 million. Now, if you think about that in population terms for California, there's a lot of money that has been approved in the HITECH Act that was part of the stimulus bill, and California is not getting your fair share yet.
Thank you. And I don't know where we are in that. I'm sure that we're considering it. But I will tell you that, and I think back to the innovation grants, and we made a huge cross-sector investment in trying to get an innovation grant that was $100 million 5 or 6 years ago from a very friendly administration, and we got nothing. And part of what happens in California is our size. In some ways, they seem to be more interested in doing something for 700,000 people than for 40 million. I mean, there's a sense that we can do it ourselves, that we have other resource, or just the sheer scope. The numbers in California are so high. The cost of doing that kind of work, there was a really interesting presentation that I heard a few months ago from Oklahoma doing some very creative things with their provider community, where they have an all-payer claims data that is voluntarily participated in by the payers, and the providers are sharing their cost information. Imagine that. We've been trying to do some kind of cost and quality data accountability, and we haven't been able to do it. Sometimes our size and scope is so overwhelming that people walk away from us. I'm very excited about what Blue Shield and Anthem are working on with Manifest MedX. They started out calling it CalIndex, and I can always remember CalIndex. I have to really work at Manifest MedX. I have no idea what it means. But it's important work because they're trying to bring the private sector and commercial market together to this work. So I really appreciate your comments. I'm sure that I've got somebody somewhere working on how we can marshal the resources to get some piece of that. But I have been a little bit frustrated sometimes with how resistant the federal government is to invest in California, just because it's always a big ticket.
I promise you.
Good.
They're excited to invest in California.
Great. Perfect. Thank you. There was, right here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm from Connecticut, and I'm curious about, in all of the states, among your colleagues as secretaries or commissioners of Health and Human Service, where you feel the best thinking is going on around the issue of interoperability. I know CHHSA pushes on this issue in terms of transformative change, but can you give a sense of where you think that best work is?
I really wish I could. I'm not technically competent. I have to assume that the stewards of change have chosen Connecticut and it's Virginia and California, because there's some assessment that those are three good spaces to work in for a variety of reasons, maybe size and scope and people or resource. I don't know what those criteria are. And actually that's a perfect segue for why this is so hard, because everybody has their own criteria. We have all the different protocols and people want different things from the system. And so I assume that these are three good states, and I have a lot of confidence in the stewards of change, and I hope that they're in these three places to build them up in ways that they become exemplars that are replicable for other communities and other places. But it's a good question. Somebody else might have a better answer. Daniel.
That's great. That's precisely the reason for the National Interoperability Collaborative, is to be able to answer that question, because I think that's a very difficult question to answer today. There's a lot of people in this room who've done a lot of great work. There's no repository for it. So we have to bring people together. You have to pick up the phone and say, do you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody about that question? And so that's the idea. There are so many wonderful things happening in California and in Connecticut and hopefully it'll continue, even though Bill's not in Virginia anymore. But that's really the purpose of that. And so we hope that we can show off the state and the great work that's going on here. And
well, that's certainly my highest priority for the remaining 9 plus or minus months between here and the transition. You know, we took the baton from the last administration, and people say, you know, how have you been able to do so much with the ACA? And in part because a couple of really important things. We never had the the partisan struggle because a Republican governor started it and passed the law and signed the law that created the exchange and committed to the Medicaid expansion. So we took that baton. Unfortunately, we also took the baton of a pretty big deficit. So I'm hoping to pass a little easier batons to the next administration. But it's also such a team sport. You know, California is very diverse, and that diversity makes it hard sometimes to get to decisions because there's so many stakeholders and so many ideas. But when you work through it all, what you get is really strong, and a lot of people invested in it. And I think that's why we are able to do some of the things we can do in California. So my commitment in the remaining months is to keep the train on the tracks, to put as much infrastructure in place to carry forward, not to tie the hands of the next administration, but to elevate the platform where they can start. You know, we had a jumping off spot that allowed us to do some pretty remarkable things over the last 8 years, and we want to have that platform at least as high as it is now and let someone else take it to, you know, the next leg of the relay.
we have one more question.
Hi, Lisa Villarreal, Oakland Joint Powers Authority for Youth. Many of us are wrestling with data sharing agreements between various public agencies, institutions, and jurisdictions. I had 3 conversations in the lunch line about that. And it's pretty clear that it really boils down to trust and communications and relationship. What are state leaders, state agency leaders, or what could you do to help facilitate these conversations at the local level? I know when it all boils down to local, but for example, you know, Health and Human Services, education, justice. Do you talk about it, and how can you encourage counties and cities to do the same around interoperability?
I'm so glad you said the word trust, because I did want to say these data trusts. I love the word data trust. I mean, those 2 words together are what is at the heart of whether we will ever succeed or not. We have, I think, pretty serious credibility problems with what we're going to do with the data, whether it's a proprietary use or a criminal use or just an exposed use. People are very uneasy about what's going to be done with their data. So creating data trusts and establishing integrity and fostering integrity and requiring integrity in the work that we do with local communities. I think, you know, I worked for Governor Brown the first time and this time. Those are my only 2 government experiences, Brown 1.0 and 2.0. In between, I've been in the private sector for my whole career in a small rural part of California that is redder than North Dakota. And I learned so much about what it is to work from the organic, from the bottom up. When people do it because they have a need for it, it lasts. You don't need enforcement, you don't need a hammer, you don't need to make anybody do anything. If they think of it, if you can get someone to take your idea and think it was their idea, you are 90% of the way on the road. So I think that I'm so glad you've got the Santa Clara group here that have reached not only within Santa Clara County, and I did it 2 or 3 years ago. I was down there and listened to one of their presentations about their data trust. It was just blew me away. And now they're in, I think, 3 counties, Santa Cruz and San Mateo, I think, have joined with Santa Clara. And those are the kinds of things that we have to show other communities what the benefits are and how they can do it. And sometimes we do have to use our regulatory authority. But a lot of times we just got to get out of the way. We've got to figure out what the impediments are and help people do what they would naturally want to do. But again, when you have that kind of diversity and you have different communities doing different things, it works there, but whether you can connect it, it's the interoperability part that seems so hard, and that this group and the leadership of this collaborative, I hope, will move that forward. But it may be that we've just got to get to a point where the technology is available, but we'll all use it in different ways and be okay with that. I don't know what that future is, but I think lifting up those examples in those communities is really important, and I thank you for the work you're doing. And you said Alameda, Oakland? Yeah, thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Anne.